courtroom was packed that Tuesday morning. Every seat filled with reporters, cameras, curious onlookers. The kind of crowd that shows up when a powerful man is about to fall, and fall hard. David Chen sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped together so tight his knuckles had turned white. Just 6 months ago, he'd been on the cover of Forbes magazine. A self-made billionaire who'd built his fortune from absolutely nothing. His company had created software that helped hospitals keep better track of patient records, saving countless lives in the process. $3.2 billion, they said he was worth. But right now, in this moment, he looked like any other man facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. The charges were serious. Federal prosecutors claimed he'd stolen $200 million from his own charity foundation. $200 million that was supposed to help sick children, fund medical research, build clinics in poor neighborhoods. Instead, according to the government, David had funneled that money into offshore accounts for his personal use. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Bank statements, transfer records, documents with his own signature on them. David had always known that success came with enemies. When you build something from nothing, when you become wealthy beyond most people's imagination, there are always those who want to tear you down. But he'd never imagined betrayal would come from the people closest to him. His chief financial officer, Victor Park, had been his college roommate. They'd started the company together in a cramped apartment, eating ramen noodles and dreaming big dreams. Victor had complete access to every account, every transaction, every financial detail of the business and the charity. David had trusted him completely. What David didn't know was that Victor had been secretly working with his biggest business rival, Kenneth Liu. Kenneth had been trying to buy David's company for years, but David had always refused. The technology they'd created was meant to help people, not to be absorbed into some corporate empire and used to maximize profits. So Kenneth had found another way. If he couldn't buy the company, he'd destroy its founder and pick up the pieces afterward. The plan had been clever, almost beautiful in its cruelty. Victor had access to everything. He'd been the one executing the fraudulent transfers, always in the middle of the night when David was traveling or sleeping. Always making sure the digital trail led back to David's accounts. And then, when the investigation started, Kenneth had quietly paid off David's lawyer, a man named Richard Hastings. A man David had paid millions over the years to handle his legal affairs. A man David had trusted with everything. The morning had started badly and gotten worse. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Angela Torres, had been methodically building her case. Document after document, number after number, painting David as a greedy man who'd pretended to care about helping others while secretly robbing them blind. The jury looked convinced. Some of them wouldn't even meet David's eyes. Then came the moment that changed everything. Richard Hastings stood up suddenly during a crucial part of the testimony. His chair scraped against the floor, the sound echoing through the silent courtroom. Everyone turned to look at him. David felt his stomach drop. Something was wrong. He could see it in Richard's face, Your Honor, Richard said, his voice steady and clear. I need to make a statement to the court. Judge Morrison, a gray-haired man with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness, looked surprised. Mr. Hastings, this is highly irregular. We're in the middle of testimony. I understand, Your Honor, but this cannot wait. Richard straightened his expensive tie, refused to look at David. I can no longer, in good conscience, continue to represent this client. I'm citing irreconcilable differences and potential ethical conflicts. I must withdraw from this case immediately. The courtroom erupted. Reporters started whispering frantically. Cameras flashed. Angela Torres tried to hide her smile but didn't quite succeed. Judge Morrison banged his gavel, calling for order. David felt like he couldn't breathe. His lawyer was abandoning him. Right now, in the middle of his trial. In the middle of the most important moment of his entire life, he wanted to stand up, to grab Richard by his designer suit and demand answers. But he couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely think. Your Honor, Richard continued, I realize the timing is problematic, but I have no choice. I will submit the proper paperwork immediately. Judge Morrison's face had hardened. He might have been fair, but he wasn't stupid. He knew something was off about this. Mr. Hastings, you realize you're leaving your client in an impossible position? This trial cannot simply stop and restart. I understand, Your Honor, but my hands are tied. Richard gathered his papers, snapped his briefcase shut. And then he walked out, just like that. Years of working together, millions in fees, all those promises about fighting until the end. None of it had meant anything. David sat there numb. He was finished. Without a lawyer, without a defense, he might as well pack his bags for federal prison right now. The jury was already convinced he was guilty. This would only seal it. "We'll take a 30-minute recess," Judge Morrison announced.
"Mr. Chen, you'll need to make arrangements for new representation."
"Though I'll be honest with you, finding someone willing to take this case at this stage will be nearly impossible." That's when David heard the voice. Your Honor, please. I need to speak." Everyone turned. Up in the gallery, standing among all the reporters and spectators, was a black woman in her late 50s. She wore a simple blue dress, the kind you might wear to church. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She clutched a worn leather handbag in front of her like a shield. Her face was determined, though her hands were shaking. Grace Johnson had worked as David's housekeeper for 15 years. She cleaned his home, prepared his meals, kept his life organized when his work threatened to consume him entirely. But she was so much more than that. She'd become family. Grace had watched the news coverage of David's arrest with growing horror. She'd seen the headlines calling him a thief, a fraud, a monster, and she'd known with absolute certainty that it was all a lie. Because Grace saw things other people didn't. When you clean someone's home, when you're there early in the morning and late at night, when you're so much a part of the background that people forget you're even there, you see the truth of who they really are. She'd seen David work 16-hour days not to make more money, but to make sure his software was perfect, that it would save more lives. She'd watched him cry when reading letters from families whose children had been helped by his foundation. She'd been there the night Victor had stayed late, the night she'd found that strange second cell phone in the guest room. She'd given it to David, not understanding its importance. David had just thanked her and put it in a drawer, too trusting to believe his oldest friend could betray him. But Grace had remembered. And when the investigation started, when she'd heard Victor's name mentioned, she'd known. She'd known exactly what had happened. Now, watching David's lawyer walk away, watching this good man sit there broken and alone, something inside Grace snapped. She thought about all the times David had helped her. When her daughter had gotten into medical school but couldn't afford it, David had quietly paid the entire tuition. When Grace had pneumonia and nearly died, David had visited her in the hospital every single day, bringing flowers and sitting by her bed. When her oldest son had gotten in trouble with the law, David had hired the best lawyer money could buy and made sure the young man got a second chance. David had never treated her like the help. He'd treated her like family, like a person who mattered, and now he needed her. "Ma'am," Judge Morrison said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is not the time for public commentary. Please sit down." "Your Honor, please," Grace said, her voice stronger now. "My name is Grace Johnson. I've worked for Mr. Chen for 15 years. I know he's innocent. I know who really did this. And if he doesn't have a lawyer anymore, then I'll defend him myself." The courtroom went completely silent for a moment. Then the laughter started. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the kind of nervous laughter people make when something absurd happens. A housekeeper? Defending a billionaire against federal charges? It was ridiculous. Impossible. Angela Torres stood up, not even trying to hide her amusement now. "Your Honor, this is beyond inappropriate. This woman has no legal training whatsoever. We cannot allow..." But David interrupted. He'd found his voice again. "Your Honor." He stood up and there were tears running down his face. "Your Honor, I trust Grace Johnson with my life. I trust her more than I trusted the man who just walked out of here. If she's willing to stand beside me, if she's willing to fight for me, then I want her as my lawyer. I'm asking the court to allow this." Judge Morrison took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He'd been a judge for 30 years. He'd seen a lot of strange things in his courtroom, but nothing quite like this. Still, there was something about the way Grace stood there, something about the determination in her eyes, something about the obvious bond between her and David that made him pause. "Mrs. Johnson," he said finally, "do you understand what you're asking? This is a complex federal case. There are procedures, rules, legal strategies that take years to learn. No offense intended, but you have no training for this." "I understand that, Your Honor," Grace said, walking forward now, past the reporters toward the front of the courtroom. "But I do know the truth. And I know David Chen. I've known him for 15 years and I know he's innocent. Maybe I don't know all the fancy legal words, but I know what's right and what's wrong. And what's happening here is wrong. Judge Morrison looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at David, standing there with tears on his face, willing to put his entire future in the hands of his housekeeper. Then he looked at Angela Torres, who was smirking like she'd already won. Something in Judge Morrison's sense of justice rebelled. He'd seen too many wealthy criminals buy their way out of prison with expensive lawyers. He'd seen too many innocent poor people go to jail because they couldn't afford proper representation. Maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to let truth matter more than money or legal credentials. I'm going to allow this, he said, and the courtroom erupted again, but with conditions. Mrs. Johnson, I'm going to assign you a legal consultant, a public defender named James Kim. He'll help you with procedures and paperwork. He can advise you, but you'll be leading the defense. Do you accept these terms? Grace took a deep breath. Her hands were still shaking. She had no idea what she was doing. She'd barely finished high school. She knew nothing about law except what she'd seen on television. But she knew David was innocent, and sometimes that has to be enough. I accept, Your Honor. David reached out and took her hand. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you. That night, Grace sat in David's mansion library surrounded by boxes and boxes of financial documents. James Kim, a young Korean-American lawyer with tired eyes and coffee-stained shirts, tried to explain the basics of courtroom procedure. How to object, how to cross-examine, how to present evidence. Grace's head spun with information, but she absorbed it like a sponge. She'd raised 4 children on a housekeeper's salary. She'd managed household budgets, juggled multiple jobs, kept everything running smoothly even when life tried to knock her down. She'd survived things that would have broken other people. She could do this. She had to do this. The key, James explained, pointing to the documents spread across the table, is showing that David couldn't have made these transfers. They all happened at times when he was provably somewhere else or when he didn't have computer access. Grace nodded, already making notes in her careful handwriting. But she was thinking about something else. That cell phone, the one she'd found in Victor's room all those months ago. The one David had put in his desk drawer and forgotten about. She'd given that phone to her daughter Shanice, who worked in cybersecurity. Just out of curiosity, just to see what was on it, and what Shanice had found had made both of them sick to their stomachs. Messages between Victor and Kenneth Liu, plans to frame David, details about bribing Richard Hastings, everything they needed to prove the truth. The question was whether a judge would allow that evidence in court, whether Grace could convince them that justice mattered more than technical rules about how evidence was collected. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, Grace studied. She read, she prepared, and she prayed that being right would be enough to win. Grace barely slept that night. She sat at David's kitchen table until 3 a.m, reading through documents until her eyes burned. James had left her with a stack of legal books and a crash course in courtroom basics, but nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to do. Every time she tried to close her eyes, she saw that courtroom, all those people staring at her, waiting for her to fail. Her daughter Shanice called around midnight. "Mama, have you lost your mind? This is all over the news. They're calling you crazy. They're saying you're going to make everything worse for Mr. Chen." "Let them talk," Grace said quietly. "I know what I'm doing. Do you, though?" Shanice's voice was worried, not mean. "Mama, these are federal prosecutors. They went to fancy law schools. They've been doing this for years. You clean houses." "I know what I am, baby," Grace said, "but I also know what's right. And I know David Chen didn't steal that money. Victor did. And that phone you analyzed for me, that's going to prove it." There was a long silence on the other end. Then Shanice sighed. "You're really going to do this, aren't you?" "I have to. Then I'm coming to court tomorrow. And Mama, I'm going to testify if you need me to, about what I found on that phone." Grace felt tears sting her eyes. "Thank you, baby. Just don't make me regret this," Shanice said. But Grace could hear the smile in her voice. The next morning, Grace put on her navy blue dress, the one she wore to church every Sunday. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. When had she gotten so old? When had those lines appeared around her eyes? But then she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. Age meant experience. Age meant wisdom. Age meant she'd survived enough storms to know how to weather one more. James picked her up at 7. He looked even more tired than the night before, his tie already crooked. Ready for this? He asked. No, Grace admitted. But I'm doing it anyway. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters. Cameras everywhere, microphones shoved in her face. Questions screamed from every direction. Mrs. Johnson, do you really think you can win this case? What makes you qualified to defend anyone in court? Is this just a publicity stunt? Are you being paid to throw this case? That last question made Grace stop. She turned to face the reporter who'd asked it, a young man with styled hair and expensive clothes. Son, she said, her voice cutting through the noise, I've spent 15 years cleaning toilets and washing floors. If I wanted publicity, I'd have found an easier way to get it. I'm here because David Chen is innocent and somebody needs to stand up for him. She pushed through the crowd and into the courthouse, James hurrying behind her. In the bathroom, Grace splashed cold water on her face and took several deep breaths. Her hands were shaking again. She gripped the edge of the sink and forced herself to be calm. She'd raised 4 children. She'd buried a husband. She'd worked 3 jobs at once to keep food on the table. She could do this. When she walked into the courtroom, it was already packed. Even more people than yesterday. Everyone wanted to see the housekeeper try to play lawyer. Most of them were probably hoping to watch her fail. Grace felt their eyes on her as she made her way to the defendant's table. David was already there, wearing a fresh suit but looking like he hadn't slept either. How are you holding up? She asked him quietly. Better now that you're here, he said. Grace, if this doesn't work, if things go badly, I want you to know. Hush now, she said firmly. We're not talking like that. We're going to fight and we're going to win. Judge Morrison entered and everyone stood. He looked at Grace with an expression she couldn't quite read. Curiosity, concern? Maybe both. Mrs. Johnson, are you prepared to proceed? Yes, Your Honor, Grace said, standing up. Her voice only shook a little. Angela Torres stood as well, and Grace could see the confidence radiating from her. The prosecutor wore a sharp black suit and expensive heels. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was perfect. Everything about her screamed success and power. Your Honor, the prosecution calls Dr. Robert Mitchell to the stand. Dr. Mitchell was a forensic accountant, the kind of expert witness who gets paid thousands of dollars to explain complicated financial crimes to juries. He had gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and spoke with the kind of authority that made people believe everything he said. Angela walked him through his credentials, 3 degrees, 20 years of experience, testimony in over 100 cases. Then she had him explain the evidence. He put up charts and graphs on screens. He talked about money transfers, offshore accounts, shell corporations. He showed how $200 million had been moved out of the charity foundation in small chunks over 3 years. And he showed how every single transfer had been authorized by David Chen's digital signature. Dr. Mitchell, Angela said, in your professional opinion, could these transfers have been made by anyone other than Mr. Chen? No, Dr. Mitchell said firmly. The transfers required Mr. Chen's unique login credentials and his digital signature. Only he had access to those. Thank you, Doctor. No further questions. Judge Morrison looked at Grace. Mrs. Johnson, would you like to cross-examine the witness? Grace stood up. Her legs felt weak, but she made herself walk forward. James had told her what to do. Ask questions. Poke holes in the testimony. Find the weak spots. But standing there, looking at this expert with his fancy degrees and his confident smile, Grace felt completely out of her depth. Then she remembered something. She remembered sitting in David's kitchen 3 months ago, making him breakfast because he'd worked all night. He'd been upset about something, talking to himself while she cooked. I don't understand, he'd been saying. These transfers are showing up, but I was in Seattle when this one happened. How did I authorize this if I was at a conference? That's when it had clicked for Grace that something was wrong. She'd started paying closer attention, started keeping track of things. Dr. Mitchell, Grace said, and her voice came out stronger than she expected. You said these transfers happened on specific dates and times, right? That's correct. And you said they happened between midnight and 3 in the morning? Yes, that's typical for this kind of fraud. The perpetrator usually acts when they think no one is watching. Grace walked over to the table where James had organized her materials. She picked up a folder. Dr. Mitchell, on February 14th of last year, you said a transfer of $8 million was made at 1:30 in the morning, correct? According to the records, yes. And that transfer required David Chen's personal authorization? Yes. Grace opened the folder and pulled out a paper. Your Honor, may I approach the witness? Judge Morrison nodded. Grace walked up and handed the paper to Dr. Mitchell. Can you tell the court what this is? Dr. Mitchell looked at it, and for the first time he seemed uncertain. This appears to be a hospital admission form. That's right. It's a hospital admission form showing that David Chen was admitted to Seattle General Hospital at 11 p.m. on February 13th with acute appendicitis. He had emergency surgery at midnight and was in recovery until the morning of February 15th. So, doctor, how did David Chen authorize a transfer at 1:30 a.m. when he was unconscious on an operating table 3,000 miles away? The courtroom went silent. Angela Torres looked up sharply. Dr. Mitchell cleared his throat. Well, it's possible he set up the transfer before the surgery. Is it? Grace interrupted. She pulled out another paper. This is a statement from the surgeon. David Chen was brought in by ambulance. He was in severe pain. He went directly into surgery. When exactly do you think he had time to sit down at a computer and authorize an $8 million transfer? Objection, Angela said, standing up. Mrs. Johnson is not qualified to question. Overruled, Judge Morrison said, and there was interest in his voice now. Continue, Mrs. Johnson. Grace felt a surge of confidence. She grabbed more papers from her folder. On March 3rd, you said another transfer of $6 million was authorized at 2:15 a.m.? That's what the records show. David Chen was in Paris that night. Here's his passport stamp. Here's his hotel receipt. Here's a photo of him at a tech summit that started at 9 a.m. Paris time, which was 3 a.m. New York time. The transfer happened while he was asleep in a hotel in France. She kept going, pulling out more evidence. Airline tickets, hotel records, conference schedules. For every major transfer Dr. Mitchell had identified, Grace showed that David had been somewhere else, traveling, speaking at conferences, in meetings with witnesses, once even at a funeral. Dr. Mitchell, Grace said finally, you're very good at following money. But you forgot to follow the man. David Chen didn't make these transfers. Someone else did. Someone who had access to his accounts and his digital signature. Isn't that possible? It's theoretically possible, Dr. Mitchell admitted reluctantly. But it would require someone with extensive access to Mr. Chen's systems, someone like his chief financial officer, Grace suggested. Someone like Victor Park, who handled all of the company's finances and had complete access to every account. Angela Torres objected again, but the damage was done. The jury was paying attention now. They weren't looking at Grace like she was crazy anymore. They were looking at her like maybe, just maybe, she knew what she was talking about. When Grace sat down, her whole body was shaking. But David grabbed her hand under the table and squeezed it. James was grinning like Christmas had come early. That was incredible, James whispered. Where did you learn to cross-examine like that? I didn't learn anything, Grace whispered back. I just told the truth. But Grace knew the hardest part was still coming. She had the evidence that could prove David's innocence. That cell phone Shanice had analyzed, with all those messages between Victor and Kenneth Liu. Messages that proved the whole thing was a setup. Messages that showed Victor had been stealing the money and framing David for it. Messages that showed they'd paid off Richard Hastings to abandon David in court. The problem was getting that evidence admitted. James had explained it to her last night. The phone had been found by Grace while she was cleaning, not by the police with a warrant. It might be considered illegally obtained evidence. A fancy lawyer like Richard Hastings would have known exactly how to get it admitted, but Grace was just a housekeeper with no legal training. Still, she had to try. After the lunch recess, Grace stood up again. Your Honor, the defense would like to call a witness. Proceed. I'd like to call my daughter, Dr. Shanice Johnson. Shanice walked into the courtroom wearing a professional blazer and carrying herself with quiet dignity. Grace felt a surge of pride watching her daughter take the oath. This was her baby girl, the one she'd worked 3 jobs to send to college, who'd become a doctor of cybersecurity. Shanice, Grace said, and then caught herself. I mean, Dr. Johnson, can you tell the court what you do for a living? I'm a cybersecurity analyst. I work for a firm that investigates digital fraud and data breaches. And do you remember approximately 6 months ago when I brought you a cell phone I'd found? Yes, ma'am. You found it while cleaning at Mr. Chen's house. You said it had been left in a guest room by Victor Park. Angela Torres was on her feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. We had no notice of this witness or this evidence. Furthermore, any evidence obtained from that phone would be inadmissible fruit of an illegal search. Grace's heart sank. This was exactly what James had warned her about. But before Judge Morrison could rule, Grace spoke up. "Your Honor, I didn't search anything. I found a phone while I was doing my job. I brought it to my employer, David Chen, thinking it belonged to his friend. He told me to give it to Victor the next time I saw him. But my daughter is curious by nature, and when I showed it to her, she analyzed it. We didn't know it contained evidence of a crime. We just wanted to see who it belonged to." "That's a very convenient story," Angela said skeptically. Judge Morrison looked troubled. "Mrs. Johnson, even if your intentions were innocent, there are rules about how evidence can be obtained." "Your Honor," Grace interrupted, and several people gasped. You weren't supposed to interrupt a judge. But Grace was desperate now. "Your Honor, please. I understand there are rules. I understand I don't know all the proper procedures. But Victor Park left that phone in David Chen's own house. David owned that house. I worked in that house. I found something that didn't belong there and tried to return it to its owner. If that's illegal, then I guess I'm guilty. But the messages on that phone prove David is innocent. They prove who really stole that money. And if the rules say we can't use the truth to prove innocence, then something is wrong with the rules." The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Morrison looked at Grace for a long, long moment. Then he looked at David, sitting there with hope and fear written all over his face. Then he looked at Angela Torres, who was already preparing her next objection. "I'm going to allow it," Judge Morrison said finally. "Mrs. Johnson's discovery of the phone was accidental and in the course of her normal duties. Mr. Chen owned the property where it was found. I'll allow Dr. Johnson's testimony about the phone's contents and will let the jury decide what weight to give it." "Objection overruled." Angela looked furious, but she sat down. Grace felt like she could breathe again. "Dr. Johnson," Grace continued, "what did you find on that phone?" "Encrypted messages," Shanice said. "Messages between Victor Park and a man named Kenneth Liu. They discussed a plan to embezzle money from Mr. Chen's charity foundation and frame Mr. Chen for the crime. They detailed how Victor would make the transfers and ensure the digital trail led back to Mr. Chen. They also discussed paying Mr. Chen's lawyer, Richard Hastings, to abandon him during the trial." The courtroom erupted. Reporters were frantically typing. The jury looked shocked. David closed his eyes, tears running down his face. "Do you have copies of these messages?" Grace asked. "Yes, ma'am. I made detailed records with timestamps and metadata proving they're authentic." Grace looked at Judge Morrison. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter these messages as evidence." Angela was objecting again, but her objections sounded weak now. The truth was out. Everyone in that courtroom knew it. David Chen hadn't stolen anything. He'd been betrayed by the people he trusted most. As Shanice left the witness stand, she caught her mother's eye and gave her a small smile. Grace smiled back, feeling something she hadn't felt since this whole nightmare began. Hope. The news spread like wildfire overnight. Every major network was covering the story. Housekeeper introduces bombshell evidence in billionaire trial. Social media exploded with opinions. Some people thought Grace was a hero. Others still insisted she was in over her head, that she'd gotten lucky with one good day in court but wouldn't last. Grace didn't pay attention to any of it. She had work to do. That evening, she sat with James and David in the mansion library again. They had the phone records spread across the table, Shanice's analysis printed out page by page. The messages between Victor and Kenneth were damning, but Grace knew Angela Torres would fight tooth and nail to discredit them. "Tomorrow's going to be brutal," James warned. "Angela knows her case is falling apart. She's going to come at us hard. She'll try to make the jury doubt the phone evidence, question Shanice's credentials, anything to create reasonable doubt." "Let her try," Grace said quietly. "We've got the truth on our side." "Truth doesn't always win in court," James said. "You need to be prepared for that." Grace looked at him steadily. "Young man, I've been preparing my whole life for this. Every time someone looked at me and saw nothing but a maid. Every time someone talked over me like I wasn't there. Every time someone assumed I was stupid because I clean houses for a living. I've been getting ready for this moment, I just didn't know it." David had been quiet most of the evening, just listening. Now he spoke up. "Grace, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you from the beginning." Grace turned to him. "What is it?" "Victor wasn't just my business partner. He was like my brother. We grew up together, poor kids from the same neighborhood. When everyone said we'd never amount to anything, we promised each other we'd prove them wrong. We built this company from nothing. David's voice broke. I trusted him with everything, and I ignored the signs that something was wrong because I didn't want to believe he could betray me. What signs? James asked, leaning forward. Little things. Money that didn't quite add up. Questions he'd dodge. Times when he'd get defensive if I asked about certain accounts. David put his head in his hands. I was a fool. I let my loyalty blind me. Grace reached over and put her hand on his shoulder. You weren't a fool. You were a good friend. Victor is the one who should be ashamed, not you. But if I'd paid attention, if I'd investigated when I first got suspicious, maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe, Grace said. Or maybe it would have happened anyway, just differently. You can't change the past, David. You can only deal with what's in front of you now. The next morning, the courtroom was even more packed than before. Grace noticed cameras from international news stations. This wasn't just a local story anymore. It had become something bigger, something about justice and class and who gets to speak in a courtroom. Angela Torres looked sharp and ready for battle. When Judge Morrison called the court to order, she stood immediately. Your Honor, the prosecution has several motions to present before we continue. Proceed. First, we move to strike Dr. Johnson's testimony about the alleged messages on the phone. The defense has not provided adequate authentication of these messages. Second, we move to have Mrs. Johnson removed as defense counsel. She has now demonstrated a clear conflict of interest as she's calling family members as witnesses. Third, we believe Mrs. Johnson's continued representation of Mr. Chen constitutes ineffective assistance of counsel. Grace felt her stomach drop. She'd known Angela would fight back, but this was a full assault. If the judge agreed, everything would fall apart. Judge Morrison looked at Grace. Mrs. Johnson, how do you respond? Grace stood up. Her mind was racing. James had prepared her for some objections, but not this many at once. She took a deep breath and did what she'd always done when life got hard. She told the truth as simply as she could. Your Honor, my daughter is a respected expert in her field. The prosecution can cross-examine her if they doubt her credentials. As for conflict of interest, I'm calling her because she's the person who analyzed the phone, not because she's my daughter. And if I'm such ineffective counsel, why is the prosecution so worried? A few people in the gallery laughed. Even Judge Morrison smiled slightly. The motions are denied. But Mrs. Johnson, the prosecution has a point about authentication. You'll need to provide more than just your daughter's word that these messages are genuine. I understand, Your Honor. And I plan to do exactly that. Angela sat down, looking frustrated. Then she stood right back up. Your Honor, the prosecution calls Victor Park to the stand. The courtroom buzzed with surprise. Victor walked in looking confident, wearing an expensive suit and an easy smile. He was younger than David, maybe 40, with perfectly styled hair and the kind of charm that made people trust him. As he walked past the defendant's table, he didn't even glance at David. Grace watched him carefully. She'd known Victor for years. She'd served him meals, cleaned up after him when he stayed late working. She'd always thought he was polite enough, but there had been something about him she never quite trusted. A smoothness that felt fake, like oil floating on water. Angela walked Victor through his background, his friendship with David since college, his role as chief financial officer, his supposed dedication to the company and its charitable work. She made him sound like a saint. Mr. Park, Angela said, did you have any knowledge that Mr. Chen was embezzling from the foundation? Not until the investigation started, Victor said sadly. I was shocked. Devastated, really. David was my best friend. I trusted him completely. Did you ever execute any unauthorized transfers? Absolutely not. Every transaction I made was authorized by David. I was just following his instructions. What about this phone that's been entered into evidence? Do you recognize it? I've never seen that phone before in my life, Victor said confidently. I don't know where it came from or why someone would claim it's mine. Angela smiled. No further questions. Judge Morrison looked at Grace. Your cross-examination, Mrs. Johnson. Grace stood up slowly. She looked at Victor for a long moment. He met her eyes with that same smooth confidence. He thought he could outsmart her. He thought she was just a maid playing dress-up. He was about to learn differently. Victor, Grace said, and she deliberately used his first name. How long have I known you? I'm not sure what that has to do with. Just answer the question, please. Victor shifted in his seat. I don't know. 15 years? Since you started working for David? That's right. 15 years. I've made you coffee probably 1,000 times. You take it black, 2 sugars. Your favorite meal is chicken parmesan. You're allergic to shellfish. You bite your nails when you're nervous, and you're doing it right now. Victor quickly pulled his hand away from his mouth. Some people in the jury box leaned forward with interest. I know you, Victor. And you know what I remember about you? You're always losing things. Your keys, your wallet, your phone. David used to joke about it. How many times did I find your stuff around that house? I don't recall. I recall. I found your wallet in the couch cushions twice. Found your keys in the bathroom once. Found your phone chargers in every room of that house. So when I found a phone in the guest room where you always stayed, what was I supposed to think? That wasn't my phone. Grace walked over to the evidence table and picked up the phone in its plastic bag. This phone had no lock on it. No password. When my daughter first turned it on, you know what was on the home screen? A photo of you and Kenneth Liu at a restaurant. Would you like to see it? Victor's confidence wavered for just a second. That doesn't prove anything. Someone could have put that there. Could they? Grace pulled out a printed photo. Your Honor, this is the photo from the phone's home screen. You can see the date stamp. It was taken 2 days before I found the phone. She handed the photo to Victor. That's you, isn't it? And that's Kenneth Liu sitting across from you. The same Kenneth Liu who's been trying to buy David's company for years. The same Kenneth Liu whose name appears in those messages. We had a business lunch. That's not illegal. No, it's not, Grace agreed. But lying under oath is. You said you never saw this phone before, but it has your picture on it. It was found in the room where you stayed, and it contains messages from your private email address. So I'll ask you again, Victor. Is this your phone? The courtroom was silent. Victor looked at Angela, but she couldn't help him now. He looked at the jury, and Grace could see him calculating, trying to figure out the right answer. I may have had a second phone, he said finally, for personal use. But I lost it months ago. I don't know how it ended up at David's house. You lost it in David's house, Grace said, because you were living a double life. You were David's trusted friend to his face, but behind his back you were stealing from him. You thought you were so smart, making those transfers in the middle of the night when David was traveling. But you made mistakes. You got sloppy. This is speculation. Is it? Grace's voice got stronger. Let me read you something. This is from one of the messages on that phone. Transfer complete. 8 million moved tonight. D was in Seattle. Won't suspect anything. That message was sent at 1:30 a.m. on February 14th. The same night David was in surgery. The same transfer Dr. Mitchell testified about. You sent that message, Victor. I did no such thing. The message came from your personal email. My daughter traced it. She has the metadata, the IP address, everything. You sent it from your apartment, your home internet connection. Do you want her to testify about that too? Victor's face had gone pale. Angela was objecting, but her objections sounded weak. Judge Morrison was watching Victor carefully, and Grace could see he was noticing the same things she was. The way Victor kept fidgeting, the way his eyes darted around, the way he couldn't maintain that confident smile anymore. Let me ask you something else, Grace said. In one of those messages you wrote to Kenneth Liu, had to increase payment to the lawyer. He's getting nervous. What lawyer were you talking about, Victor? I don't know what message you're referring to. Richard Hastings, Grace said. David's lawyer. The man who walked out of this courtroom 3 days ago and abandoned his client. You paid him to do that, didn't you? That's absurd. Is it? Because Mr. Hastings had a sudden deposit of $500,000 in his bank account 2 weeks before this trial started. I checked, and there's another message on your phone where you tell Kenneth, lawyer is on board. We'll drop the case at the right moment to maximize damage. You wrote that, Victor. You planned all of this. Victor stood up suddenly. I don't have to listen to this. This woman is making up lies. Sit down, Mr. Park, Judge Morrison said sharply. You'll answer Mrs. Johnson's questions. Victor sat, but he looked like a trapped animal now. Grace felt no satisfaction in watching him squirm. She just felt tired and sad. This man had destroyed his best friend's life out of greed. Victor, Grace said, and her voice was gentler now. I watched you and David together for 15 years. I saw how much he trusted you, how much he cared about you. You were like brothers. Why did you do it? Was the money really worth losing all that? For a moment, Victor's mask cracked completely. Grace saw anger and shame and something else in his face. You don't understand, he said quietly. It was always David's company. David's success. David's name in the papers. I did half the work, but nobody ever saw me. I was just the guy in the background. Kenneth offered me a chance to have something of my own. To be somebody. By destroying your friend. By taking what should have been mine. Victor's voice rose. I built that company too. But David got all the credit, all the glory. People acted like he did it alone, like I was just his assistant. I deserved better than that. The courtroom was dead silent. Victor seemed to realize what he'd just said. He looked at Angela in panic, but the damage was done. He hadn't confessed to the embezzlement outright, but he'd admitted to resentment, to working with Kenneth, to feeling entitled to something that wasn't his. Grace walked back to her table and sat down. She felt exhausted, emotionally drained. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Morrison called for a recess. As the courtroom emptied, David sat with his head in his hands. I can't believe it, he kept saying. I can't believe he hated me all this time. He didn't hate you, Grace said quietly. He hated himself, and he blamed you for it instead of looking in the mirror. James was practically bouncing with excitement. Grace, that was incredible. You got him to basically confess on the stand. Angela's whole case is falling apart. But Grace didn't feel triumphant. She just felt sad. Sad for David, who'd lost a friend. Sad for Victor, who'd thrown away everything good in his life for money and ego. Sad for all the people who'd been hurt by this mess. It's not over yet, she said. Angela still has closing arguments. The jury still has to deliberate. Anything could happen. But we're winning, James insisted. Grace looked at him. Maybe. But winning doesn't fix everything that's been broken here. David's reputation is damaged. His company is in chaos. His trust in people is shattered. Even if the jury finds him not guilty, he's still lost so much. David looked up at her. But I haven't lost you. You stood by me when everyone else walked away. That matters more than anything. Grace patted his hand. That's what family does. We stand by each other. Outside the courthouse, reporters mobbed Grace again. The questions came fast and furious. She answered a few, keeping her responses simple and honest. Yes, she believed David was innocent. No, she wasn't a trained lawyer. Yes, she was nervous. No, she wouldn't stop fighting until this was over. One reporter asked, Mrs. Johnson, what made you think you could do this? Defend someone in federal court with no legal training? Grace looked at the camera and spoke from her heart. I didn't think I could do it. I just knew I had to try. Sometimes you don't need to have all the qualifications or all the answers. Sometimes you just need to care enough to stand up and fight for what's right. David Chen gave me a chance when I needed one. He treated me with dignity when others looked right through me. When he needed someone, I wasn't going to let him down. That's all this is. One person standing up for another person because it's the right thing to do. The clip went viral within hours. People around the world shared it, commented on it, argued about it. Grace became a symbol for something bigger than just one trial. She became a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they found the courage to try. But Grace didn't see herself as extraordinary. She was just doing what needed to be done. And tomorrow, she would walk back into that courtroom and keep fighting. Because that's what you do for family. The morning after Victor's testimony, Grace woke up to find her face on the front page of every major newspaper. The housekeeper who broke a billionaire's best friend. The headlines were everywhere. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Her other children kept calling, some proud, some worried. Her church group wanted to throw her a party. Neighbors she'd barely spoken to in years suddenly wanted to be her best friend. Grace ignored most of it. She had one more day in court, and it would be the hardest one yet. Today was closing arguments. Today, Angela Torres would use every trick she'd learned in law school to convince the jury that David was guilty. And today, Grace would have to stand up and give the most important speech of her life. She practiced in front of the bathroom mirror while getting ready. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury. No, that sounded too stiff. Your Honor, members of the jury. Better, but still not right. Grace sighed and looked at her reflection. Who was she kidding? She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't know how to give closing arguments. She was just a woman who cleaned houses and raised children and tried to do right by people. Maybe that would have to be enough. James met her for breakfast at a small diner far from the courthouse, away from the cameras and reporters. He looked nervous, drumming his fingers on the table and drinking coffee like it was water. "You don't have to write out a whole speech," he said, pushing his notes across to her. "I've written down the key points you need to hit. The evidence about David being in different locations. The phone records. Victor's testimony. Just stick to these points and you'll be fine." Grace looked at the notes but didn't pick them up. "James, can I ask you something?" "Of course. When you give closing arguments, do you read from notes?" "Sometimes. Depends on the case. Why?" "Because I don't think I can do that. If I read from a paper, I'm not going to sound like me. I'm going to sound like someone pretending to be a lawyer." Grace folded her hands on the table. "I think I just need to talk to them. Like I'm talking to you right now. Like real people having a real conversation about something that matters." James looked worried. "Grace, these closing arguments could make or break the case. Are you sure you want to wing it?" "I'm not winging it. I know what I want to say. I've been thinking about it all night." She smiled at him. "You've taught me a lot this week, James. But the one thing I already knew was how to tell the truth in a way people can hear it. That's all I'm going to do." The courtroom was standing room only. Grace had never seen it this packed. People were literally pressed against the back wall, hoping to hear how this would end. She saw familiar faces in the crowd. Her daughter Shanice, of course, sitting in the front row. Her son Marcus, who'd driven 6 hours to be there. Some of the other families David had helped over the years. People whose medical bills he'd paid or whose children he'd sent to college. They were all there to support him. Judge Morrison called the court to order. "Ms. Torres, you may present your closing argument." Angela stood up, and Grace had to admit she was impressive. She wore a deep red suit that commanded attention. Her voice was strong and clear as she addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not complicated. The defense wants you to believe in conspiracy theories and elaborate plots, but the facts are simple. $200 million was stolen from a charitable foundation. That money was supposed to help sick children, fund medical research, save lives. Instead, it ended up in offshore accounts. And every single transfer was authorized by David Chen." Angela paced in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. "Yes, Mr. Chen has a sympathetic defender. Mrs. Johnson is clearly a kind woman who cares about her employer. But caring about someone doesn't make them innocent. The defense showed you that Mr. Chen was traveling during some of these transfers. But Mr. Chen is a tech billionaire. He has computers, phones, tablets. He could have authorized these transfers from anywhere in the world." She pointed at Victor's empty chair. "The defense tried to blame Victor Park. They showed you some messages on a phone. But think about this logically. If Victor Park was stealing money, why would he keep evidence of it on an unsecured phone? Why would he leave that phone at Mr. Chen's house? It doesn't make sense. What makes sense is that Mr. Chen, facing investigation, created a scapegoat. Victor Park was loyal to this company for 20 years. He had no motive to steal." Angela's voice softened, became almost gentle. "I know you want to believe David Chen is innocent. He's done good things.